good to be alive in this land of ours. Good to drive in this land of ours.
Hello, Canada hockey fans in the United States.
These healthy bruisers are A, vacationists, B, delegates to an Elks convention, C, members of the Nature Lovers Society, D, a hockey team. If you guessed D, you're right. The lads in question are the crack Toronto Maple Leafs, currently training for the 1950 ice season at St. Catharines, Ontario. Appetites are hearty in Canada's Lake Country, and Coach Joe Primo loses no time in diagramming plays to his earnest pupils. Goalie Turk Broda, defenseman Bill Barilko, two of the league's leading stars. A workout on the ice. The Stanley Cup champions of 1946 and 1947 practice body checks and stick work in training for the new season.
Well, hello, everybody. Jesus, good to be back in the air chair, as they call it. So nice to see you all again, and nice to be seen. And I can't believe that Glenn would start off with a quiz, A, B, C, or D. And I haven't even started, and I've already failed. But anyway, we're all going to have a good time this afternoon and go from there. So thank you, everybody, for joining us today. Hard to believe Hockey Time Machine is over 3 years old. Something that was originally envisioned just to get us to coast through COVID with friends and hockey. And here we are 3 years on and getting more adventurous, greater guests. Not me by any means. I don't mean that. And just having so much fun and the same faces once again, which is terrific. My thanks to, of course, to Paul Patskow, who engineered this whole thing from the beginning, and Glenn Dreyfus, who is a producer extraordinaire and really makes things go. So why don't we get into it? Today, we're going to talk about what I consider to be hockey's first dynasty. But okay. If I was entirely truthful, I guess I would have to admit that the NHL's first dynasty was actually the original Ottawa Senators franchise. They won the Stanley Cup in 1920, 1921, 1923, and 1927. Pretty formidable collection of championships there. Now, the first three were against other leagues, the Pacific Coast Hockey Association for the first two, and the Western Hockey League for the third one. And then the Stanley Cup became the sole property of the National Hockey League in 1927. And that's the year that Ottawa won the Stanley Cup that year as well. So I guess I have to defer to them to some degree. But for tonight anyway, we're going to discuss the Toronto Maple Leafs dynasty, how it was developed, details of the four championships they had through 1946 through until 1946-47 through until 1950-51. And why the dynasty came to an end. So I'm really looking forward to talking to you about this, because this is an era that's really, really special to me, something that I've studied fairly extensively with great interest, lots of great stories, lots of great storylines, and so we'll get into it there. So to think even further, the dynasty extends back to 1942 and 1945, but I don't include them for a specific reason, because in 1942 is that terrific Stanley Cup championship, losing the first three games to the Detroit Red Wings, and then coming back to win the next four in a row. Hap Day's finest moments, in my opinion. Then the boys went off to war shortly after that, and the team fragmented in many ways. A lot of the boys went off to serve their country, and they brought in a whole new ensemble of players. So it was an entirely different team in 1945. And in fact, it's an entirely different team than the one that we're going to talk about over the next little while. So I don't include them as part of the dynasty, although it was a hell of a decade for the Toronto Maple Leafs at that particular time. So there are three key reasons, in my opinion, for the success of the Toronto Maple Leafs during the latter part of the 1940s. And it was the success of the farm system in many ways. And let's talk about that for a few moments' time as well. Conn Smythe wanted to develop a system where more Toronto area boys would one day join the Toronto Maple Leafs. In 1945, they won the Stanley Cup. It was an unlikely win at that point, but they won nevertheless. But they didn't make the playoffs the next year. And that was a real concern to Smythe, made him super angry. And so, so what he decided to do is to build a farm system. And he put his son, Stafford Smythe, in charge of putting that together. You'll excuse me here. There we go. There's Stafford Smythe on the left and his father, Conn Smythe, on the right. At this point, Conn Smythe is the managing director of the Toronto Maple Leafs, but for all intents and purposes, he's the owner. Stafford had been a good junior hockey player, but he finished his playing career in 1942, and he was put in charge of creating a farm system for the Toronto Maple Leafs organization. So it would start with 13-year-olds playing with Shopsy's Pee-wees. You may have heard that name occasionally. If you go through different databases, you may have seen it as well. Shopsy's was in fact the sponsor. Sam Shopsowitz, who was a real entrepreneur, I guess I'll say, owned a deli here in Toronto, and he sponsored the team at that point. So that's why it was Shopsy's Pee-wees. So then players would progress from there. They would go to the Marlborough's minor bantams and the major bantams, and then to the Toronto Marlborough midgets as well. And then if they continued to progress as they went along, they played for the the Weston Dukes, the Weston Dukes, a junior B hockey team. And then if they progressed beyond that, they went to the Toronto Marlboroughs, which was the junior A team. And that team was overseen by Harold Ballard and Stafford Smythe, and was coached by Bob Davidson in 1945, 46, and 46, 47. Bob had been the captain of the Toronto Maple Leafs in 1945. So you can see the progression. Not everybody rose through the ranks, as you can imagine. In fact, very few did. But you can see the development of a farm system for the Toronto Maple Leafs. And it really paid dividends, as you'll find out a little bit later on. At the same time, the St. Michael's College had a hockey program too. St. Michael's College was a private boys' school here in Toronto. It was Roman Catholic for all intents and purposes. You'll excuse me again. Jeez. Oh my goodness. Too many burritos for dinner. Well, I didn't really actually, but anyway. So St. Michael's College, we can't seem to find any paperwork that gives us an establishment of an actual date when they became involved with the Toronto Maple Leafs as well. But needless to say, by the 1940s, St. Michael's Majors and the entire St. Michael's organization was part of the Toronto Maple Leafs development plan as well. To put it in a secular sort of way, the Toronto Marlboroughs were the Protestant boys for the most part, and the Toronto St. Michael's Majors were the Roman Catholic boys at that point as well. And they also had their own pecking order. They had the St. Michael's midgets. They had the St. Michael's Junior B Buzzers. And then, of course, we had the St. Michael's Majors, which was their Junior A team at that time. And in the 1940s, certainly in the early 40s, right through until the middle 40s, Toronto was also affiliated on the junior level with the Oshawa Generals of the Ontario Hockey Association. And they also had the Winnipeg Monarchs out west, another junior franchise as well. I think they might have had the Lethbridge Maple Leafs too, but I can't ascertain 100%. So you can see that there was a farm system that was set up, hoping to filter or channel some great hockey players into the National Hockey League team for the Toronto Maple Leafs. And these farm teams were set up. The boys were watched. They were coached. In many ways, they were fathered as well. They were counseled in hockey, but also with with school and life, especially in the St. Michael side of things. And they were really taught the fundamentals to prepare the boys for a possible National Hockey League career. As I said, very few made it all the way through. We'll talk about a couple a little bit later on. But it was the system that was set up, hoping to channel more Toronto area boys into the National Hockey League. They also had, I've got a buddy here now. There's Sky wanting to say hello. They also had a great scouting system. It was headed by a guy named Squib Walker. His real name was George Walker, but there's Squib Walker there. He had served in the war with Conn Smythe, and he was brought into the fold as well. They knew each other through the University of Toronto as well. That's one of the things that you'll find with Conn Smythe, is that he was very loyal to his friends. Whether that was a good thing or a bad thing, it actually proved to be a very, very good thing in many ways. But Squib Walker was based in Thunder Bay. It actually was called Fort William at the time, in the what we would know today as the Thunder Bay area. And he was by day an insurance salesman and a stockbroker, but he had a really good eye for talent. And so Conn Smythe had put him in charge of the scouting system for the Toronto Maple Leafs. Now, Squib Walker was a very smart man. He knew he couldn't do it all alone, although he sure tried many times. But he had what he called bird dogs. That's a term that we still use today in many ways, but it's eyes and ears set out across the country looking for hockey talent and then channeling some great information to the head of the scouting system. So he had bird dogs right across the country looking for talent that he could then take a look at, evaluate, potentially bring forward to Conn Smythe and the management team of the Toronto Maple Leafs. So a pretty amazing story right then and there. A farm system, a great scouting team across the country. And in fact, let's talk about his victories. In 1939-40, he has Wally Stanowski on the Maple Leafs, and he's the runner-up for the Calder Trophy as the Rookie of the Year. 41-42, Gay Stewart wins the Calder Trophy, Rookie of the Year. 42-43, it's Gus Bodner. 44-45, Frank McCool, although to be candid, Squib didn't necessarily scout him. And 1946-47, Howie Meeker from Stratford with the Crailers. So he and the team did a great job in finding superb hockey talent across this dominion of ours that had so much hockey talent at that time. So those were really very important sources of finding the talent. But I'm going to talk about the very, very best one. And it's the one that very few people would even think about. And it took me a little while to come to this conclusion as well. Every Saturday night, Foster Hewitt broadcast Hockey Night in Canada on the radio. There he is speaking into, he bought a radio station many years later, CKFH, the FH standing for Foster Hewitt. But Foster Hewitt was on the radio every single Saturday night, and it was the most listened to program on the radio, broadcast right across, again, this dominion once again. And it had, this is prior to television, it had every family sitting in front of the radio, listening to the hockey game on Saturday night and listening to the team that was the host team every time, the Toronto Maple Leafs. And it was hugely influential. Boys all across Canada wanted to play for the Toronto Maple Leafs as a result. And because they heard their heroes on the radio every week. So let's think about the Toronto Maple Leafs now as we move into the dynasty that we have promised. We've got a great farm system that's been implemented. We've got a great network of scouts, and now we've got the broadcasts of Foster Hewitt dedicated to the Toronto Maple Leafs and endearing itself to hockey players right across this country. So there are a number of players that certainly would be filtered into the Maple Leaf system over the little while and over the next little while through the 1940s. Some of the names that you would know from the Marlboros, Bob Goldham, Hank Goldup briefly was a Maple Leaf as well. Danny Lewicki, who many of us have seen at different Society for International Hockey Research events. Elwyn Mo Morris, Gay Stewart, who I've mentioned earlier as well. From the Toronto St. Michael's Majors, Les Costello, Father Les Costello, Johnny McCormick, who we've gotten to know a little bit as well since his past, as all of them too. Gus Mortson, who we'll discuss, Todd Sloan, Jimmy Thompson, and then from the Oshawa Generals in the early 1940s, Bill Ezenicki and Billy Taylor. So that's a pretty formidable foundation for this Toronto Maple Leaf hockey team in the 1940s. The Montreal Canadiens had a farm system, not quite as elaborate as the Toronto Maple Leafs. They had priests across the country who, like the Toronto Maple Leafs did with St. Michael's, the priests trying to give their better hockey players a free education. The priests across Quebec did the same thing, trying to give free educations to the or at least a hockey opportunity to some of their better hockey players with the Montreal Canadiens. During this, what we call the original six era, the New York Rangers, the Boston Bruins, Chicago Blackhawks, Detroit Red Wings, all great teams. They had some challenges in Chicago. A little bit later on, they would with Boston and New York as well. But they didn't have the same elaborate system that the Toronto Maple Leafs and to a lesser degree the Montreal Canadiens had. So as I mentioned a little bit earlier on, 1945, the Maple Leafs were the unlikely winners of the Stanley Cup. It was an odd mix of players. They had some veterans who had been refused military service, along with university students who were ineligible to serve. So they put together the team, and it surprisingly did very, very well. They finished third that season with 52 points, well back of the Montreal Canadiens, who had 80 points, and Detroit, who had 67. But in the first round of the playoffs, Toronto beat the Montreal Canadiens, which was unheard of at that time, at that year rather, certainly because of the shift of power. The Montreal Canadiens were the elite of the league at that particular time. They went on to beat the Detroit Red Wings in 7 games in the final to win the Stanley Cup. No one, including Conn Smythe, dreamed that they would win the Stanley Cup at that particular time. One of the reasons for the success, well, it was on the shoulders of their goaltender, a guy by the name of Frank McCool. And he's quite a story unto himself. He had gone to the New York Rangers training camp in 1943-44, but his ulcers had acted up. He had a terrible, terrible time with his stomach. Really, really bad time with his stomach. So he quite often would have to take off to the bench, drink a glass of milk, and come back and finish the game from there. It was a really serious problem. He sat out the entire 1943-44 season, as a matter of fact. So when Turk Broda, who had been the stalwart goaltender for the Toronto Maple Leafs since the 1930s, when Broda joined the military, they needed a goaltender. They looked at some of their junior players. They just didn't fit the bill. Hap Day, who was the coach, brought in an old friend of his as well to play as well, to see if he might fit in, and that didn't work. It actually worked for a little while, but Frank McCool came in, was signed, and he played all 50 games that season, the 1944-45 season. He led the NHL with 4 shutouts, and then they go into the playoffs, and this is where the magic even more so took place. They're playing in the playoffs, and he gets another 4 playoff shutouts. The first 3 of them were in the Stanley Cup final. Imagine the first 3 games of the Stanley Cup final playing against the Detroit Red Wings, and he shut them out in each of those 3 games. So you have to think that 1945 Stanley Cup championship is due to much effort, great coaching, but certainly the goaltending of Frank McCool, who, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, ended up winning the Calder Trophy that year. And if they had a Conn Smythe Trophy, I'm sure that he would have won that as well. But I'm presuming at that point. I don't know why, but I'm getting a little hoarse. Pardon me. There we go. Our sponsor, nice Ajax water. There we go. 1945-46. This is where things start to really change. As I mentioned earlier, the 1945 roster was almost completely changed. There were still some that continued on, but the boys were filtering back from the war at that point. And as I had mentioned a little bit about Conn Smythe, he was bound and determined to get some more Toronto players on his team. And as he built the farm system with his son and made sure the scouting system was great and put some farm teams into place, he figured it would be 3 to 5 years before they were able to win another Stanley Cup championship, which would have put them into the 1948, 49, 50 seasons, thereabouts, and go from there. Well, there was a very pleasant surprise for Conn Smythe, even though he wasn't there for a great deal of the 1945-46 season. Several of those who had served the country are coming back, as I mentioned. They bring back, well, they don't bring back, they get back Sil Apps, Bill Ezenicki, Bob Goldham, Bud Poyle, Gay Stewart, Billy Taylor as well. So you can see that the core that had really helped them in 1942 has now returned. They've got a little more experience, life experience, not hockey experience necessarily, although some of them played during the war as well. But it changed the core of the team immediately. And as I mentioned, they were much more similar to the 1942 Stanley Cup championship. But what were they going to do about the goaltending? That's the tricky part. Turk Broda came back a little bit later on, but they've already got Frank McCool, who almost single-handedly won the Stanley Cup for the Leafs in 45 and was the top rookie that year as well. The problem was he asked for a raise. Can you imagine? He asked for a $500 raise. He was making $4,500 for a season, and he wanted $5,000. And Conn Smythe and Hap Day said, no way, we're not paying that kind of money. So McCool went home and he worked as a sports writer. He worked for the Calgary newspaper out there. So in the meantime, they brought in Bastien. They tried Gordie Bell again, who would play. He was Hap Day's friend, who I didn't really mention very well a little bit earlier on. They tried him as well. The problem was it wasn't working. They weren't winning, and the fans got restless. Like a Toronto crowd? Yeah, I guess so. They started to cheer or chant, I guess I should say, bring back McCool, bring back McCool. So Toronto did what they had to do. They brought back Frank McCool from early December until February, but it didn't make a great deal of difference. The team wasn't particularly good. They were struggling, and in February, Turk Broda came back, played the final 15 games of the season, but the team missed the playoffs that year. Ted Kennedy was hurt. Sil Apps was hurt, so they lost leadership and some of their offensive power as well. They finished fifth. After winning the Stanley Cup, they finished fifth and missed the playoffs for the first time in 16 seasons, if you can imagine. It was only the second time in NHL history that the Stanley Cup champion, did not make the playoffs the next year. So Conn Smythe, as you can imagine, who was a pretty feisty guy at the best of times, was furious, and he wanted to start what he called internally the Great Rebuild. One of the things that he did is he picked up the Hollywood Wolves as an affiliate team as well. They were in the Pacific Coast Hockey League. Now you have to think of the pecking order here. There's the Toronto Maple Leafs of the National Hockey League, the Pittsburgh Hornets in the American Hockey League, the Tulsa Oilers in the, what would it be? Central Hockey League, I believe. I believe it was. And then the Hollywood Wolves as the fourth rung in the ladder as well. Hollywood Wolves will come to the fore in a few moments' time. You'll find out a little bit more about them, but at least that way he had places for some great hockey players, for the talent that was coming back from the war, for the prospects that he needed a place to find as well. The juniors who had graduated from both teams, actually the three teams if you include Oshawa as well. What was going on at the same time? Well, the major, they called him Major Conn Smythe, Major Smythe. He was actually still serving his country at that time. Hadn't quite come back yet. And the Toronto Maple Leafs were run by a committee that included Ed Bickle, who was the president of Maple Leaf Gardens, and he's the one who was sitting there. Hap Day, who's standing behind him in the cardigan. Hap Day was the coach of the team and the de facto assistant general manager. The vice president of Maple Leaf Gardens was William McBrien, W.A. McBrien. And then to the right-hand side, Frank Selke, who was really the assistant manager. Candidly, he was probably the general manager while Con was away as well. So that was the brain trust of the Toronto Maple Leafs while Conn Smythe was away, and they worked very, very well. And there's a great story, or not necessarily a great story, I don't know, about Frank Selke rather picking up a prospect by the name of Ted Kennedy in exchange for Frank Eddles, who, he had a bit of an NHL career, but Ted Kennedy had a Hall of Fame career. And Conn Smythe was furious because he hadn't been brought into the conversation. But it certainly had paid off, and he realized later on that Ted Kennedy was arguably the greatest Leaf that he ever oversaw. So these were the four gentlemen who were making the decisions for the team at that time. But Conn Smythe had a suspicion that there was something afoot, that he was going to be removed from his role as the general manager, and maybe a bigger role as well. And so when he was getting little tidbits from some of the other governors and some of the other owners and things of that sort, he decided he would take matters into his own hands. And he made Frank Selke the scapegoat for missing the playoffs. Now, Frank Selke was no fool by any means. He was a terrific hockey man, knew his role. In fact, if I can read a note that he wrote, without doubt, Conn Smythe was the boss at Maple Leaf Gardens. No one wanted it otherwise. When the Maple Leafs were having their long run of success, no one bothered to credit me with any great part in the triumphs. But now, when we failed to make the playoffs, I was naturally selected to be the GOAT. And that's not greatest of all time, folks. It was really the GOAT there. They got into a bit of a battle. And at one point, Frank Selke had gone out for lunch. And Conn Smythe went down to confer with him on something. Goodness knows what it was at that point. And he saw that Selke was gone. So when Selke came back, he sent a note. He may have actually said it, I can't remember offhand, that he was never to leave his desk unless he told Conn Smythe where he was going. And Frank Selke left a note on Conn Smythe's desk that said, Lincoln freed the slaves, and that was the day that he resigned, May 31st, 1946, the end of that part of the era. It hurt Selke to the quick in many ways, but he was free from the shackles I shouldn't have used that term, but free from the command that Conn Smythe demanded at that point. The rumor was that he was going to take over the Cincinnati Arena and be the general manager there, but to everybody's surprise, especially Conn Smythe's, he was hired as the general manager of the arch rival Montreal Canadiens 6 weeks later. So you have to think that Montreal realized the value that Selke had with the organization, and thought what a great asset he would be for their organization as well. Bothered Conn Smythe immeasurably, but he had to move on. It bothered Selke immeasurably, but he moved on and had immense success there. They didn't mend their friendship until about 1961, when the Hockey Hall of Fame was being put together in Toronto. They had not had a bricks and mortar building at that point. They had always hoped to build one in Kingston, and when it didn't happen for so long, from 1943 on, Sky wants to say hello. So sorry. He loves the Maple Leafs more than any of us. You go sit down now. You'll hear more about Bill Barocco later. Oh, darn cat. So they mended their fences at that point because they worked together to get the Hockey Hall of Fame landed in Toronto, first of all at the Canadian National Exhibition Grounds. But that's a story for another day. We'll move on. So in 1947, through the support of J.P. Bickle, he was a really important guy, but he was in the shadows. In fact, he was one of the people who owned, one of several who owned the Toronto St. Patrick's. And when the rumor was that the Toronto Maple Leafs might move to Philadelphia, Bickle was right there, and Conn Smythe came forward and said, listen, I need your help here. He had just been fired from the New York Rangers, where he helped set up their inaugural team. He needed J.P. Bickle's support to hopefully get access to the team. In fact, he wanted to buy it. He didn't have enough money on his own, but he needed wonderful benefactors like J.P. Bickle. So Bickle committed to keeping his money from the St. Pat's into the team that Conn Smythe wanted to put together. And he knocked on a whole lot of doors, metaphorically, to get the money to buy the team, later on to build Maple Leaf Gardens as well. So J.P. Bickle was a really, really important guy, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. But through a $300,000 loan given to Smythe by Bickle, he was able to get the managing control as the largest shareholder of Maple Leaf Gardens, and that took place just before the 1946-47 season. So it plays into our whole Dynasty franchise and moves forward. He had already been the managing director, and in fact was the de facto general manager, and acted as though he was the owner and president of the team. Had been doing so since 1927, but it became official in 1947. So as I mentioned, Conn decides that it's going to take 3 to 5 years, but he's going to dig in and he's going to make this team a championship. He and Hap Day sat down and they talked to different players on the team. They talked to Bob Davidson, who I'd mentioned earlier. He was the captain of the team in 1945. They asked him to retire in 1946, 1945-46, after that season, throwing dangling the carrot, I guess I should say, that they would give him a role with the Toronto Maple Leafs organization. In fact, it was to coach the Toronto Marlboros. So Bob Davidson retires. Sweeney Schreiner is asked to retire. He had gone to serve his country as well, and he came back and played a little bit, but he was asked to retire. So he went into coaching as well. He coached in Lethbridge, and they asked Lorne Carr to retire as well. Lorne Carr was quite a veteran. He'd played with the New York Americans earlier on, had played with the Leafs for quite a while, and he was the gentleman who brought Frank McCool's name forward as well. But he ended up retiring and moving back to Calgary too. And at that point, they also made a couple of trades, some pivotal trades as well. They traded Billy Taylor to Detroit for Harry Watson. Now, why was that important? Well, Billy Taylor was a hell of a hockey player. He'd played with Oshawa, but even before that, he was the mascot for the Toronto Maple Leafs, which he didn't put on a fuzzy costume. I don't mean that, but at that point, mascots would go out between periods and skate around and do some stick handling, wearing a little Maple Leafs jersey. So that was the role that he had as a mascot with the Toronto Maple Leafs. So people really were well versed in Billy Taylor already. Goes on to star with the Oshawa Generals, comes up and plays with the Toronto Maple Leafs, and really was a terrific center and a great player on the team. But Harry Watson had something else. He'd been with the New York Americans, he'd been with the Detroit Red Wings, but he was still young. But he was a big, hulking guy, not particularly physical, but a really strong guy who would add a great deal to the forward lines as well. They also picked up Vic Lynn. He was traded from Montreal. Vic Lynn is one of the great trivia questions that you'll ever hear. Who's the only NHL player to play for all original six teams? Ladies and gentlemen, it's Vic Lynn. True story. They also traded Babe Pratt to Boston. Babe Pratt was an interesting gentleman. Babe Pratt had some Indigenous blood, and not that was of any concern, but Babe had been the Hart Trophy winner as the most valuable player in 1944. Terrific hockey player. The next year, he also wanted a raise and came forward, and Hap Day and Conn Smythe wouldn't give him the raise. So what was his philosophy? Well, he figured that if he was being paid at what he thought was half a season's salary, he'd only play for half a season. So, he kind of played okay the first half of the season. The last half of the season, he was a ball of fire. He was one of the reasons they won the Stanley Cup that year. In fact, he scored the Stanley Cup winning goal that year. But along with that, he had a drinking problem. He in fact, during the playoffs, mostly in 1945, was unwieldy. they had to bring his mother in to stay with him to keep him on the straight and narrow. When the boys were on the road going into the other five, well, I guess mostly the other four, not the other four, the four American franchises during that era, Babe Pratt was the guy who would talk to the rookies on the team or the younger guys on the team and get them to smuggle beer and cigarettes back for him so that he didn't get in trouble. And if they got caught, they'd get in trouble. But because he was Babe Pratt and one of the stars of the team, most of them did it, and much to his happiness. Babe Pratt got into real trouble earlier that year. He was betting. He was gambling on hockey games. He swore up and down that he never bet against his team. He always bet on his team. But nevertheless, the NHL was trying to clamp down on gambling in hockey. Conn Smythe was trying to do the same thing. Maple Leaf Gardens had what they called a bull ring, and that was an area of the gardens, of the arena, where the gamblers congregated and took bets. And so people recognized for a couple of seasons that in behind whatever it was, I think it was the greens on a certain section, that was where the bull ring was taking place. Well, it was causing problems. They wanted to clean up gambling in hockey. And so they had to get rid of the bull ring. Babe Pratt gets caught gambling not on his team, but on hockey. And so he was suspended by the National Hockey League. It didn't last for very long. It lasted for 5 games, and then he was brought back because he promised he would never do it again. And he promised he was not betting against his Toronto Maple Leafs. But not too long after that whole I don't know, situation, he was driving, got into a car accident. He had open beer on his front seat. So Conn Smythe had enough. He may be a great hockey player, a great big hockey player, a terrific defenseman, but he didn't need that anymore. And so he traded Pratt to Boston Bruins. So at this point now they need to fill the roster, and they're going to bring in some of the young talent. So they brought up some defensemen. Garth Bush came up. He was from Western Canada. They brought up Gus Mortson. They brought up Jimmy Thompson. Jimmy Thompson had been at training camp since he was 16 years old, but he was a terrific prospect as well. Had come from St. Mike's. He'd actually played with the Marlboros as well. There's Jimmy there. He looks all of 16 years old right there. That would have been at training camp just prior to the 1945-46 season. Jimmy Thompson was a wonderful defenseman, and he went on to be captain of the team later on, was involved later on with the NHL Players Association that Ted Lindsay had started. Again, I can get into all of these sidebars at another time, but he was involved that way, and as a result was banished to the Chicago Blackhawks by the Toronto Maple Leafs and was not forgiven for his actions. Excuse me. I'm so sorry, everybody. So who was left from the previous teams? Well, there were only 4 guys who were over 30 years old. Sil Apps, who was the captain of the team, Turk Broda, the goaltender we've talked about, and the 2 Metz brothers, Don and Nick. And they were all 30 years or older. The rest of the team was still in their 20s. And in fact, at that point, when they put the team together in 1946-47, the average age of the team was 24.1 years, which was the youngest in National Hockey League history at that point. I guess we can kind of parallel it to the Toronto Maple Leafs of a couple of years ago with Marner and Matthews and all of the young guys who were part of that team at that time as they grew together. At that point, Sil Apps had decided he'd been given the number 9. Sorry, I'm going to step back for a second. Ted Kennedy had been given the number 9 by his idol, Charlie Conacher, and who had worn it during the 1930s and had been one of the greatest players of all time. There's Ted Kennedy there with a gentleman who we'll talk about. His name is John Arnott. Why is John Arnott important? Well, during the 1940s, John Arnott became a hockey fan. He had moved to Toronto from Scotland and owned a gas station. And one day they were taking care of some of the police cars that were in the area and just filling them up with gas or whatever. And somebody gave him a couple of tickets for a Toronto Maple Leafs game. And he gladly went, having never seen a hockey game before. And he fell in love with the game. There was one player in particular that he fell in love with, was a guy named Pete Langell. And out of the blue, all of a sudden, from his seats up in what would be considered the grays, today they'd be the purples, it would be, "Come on, Peter!" And he would scream it out. Some of the folks in the crowd were really upset with him, but most people really thought it was great that somebody would cheer like that for Pete Langell, who was one of the stars of the team at the time. After Pete Langell retired, John Arnott had to find a new idol, someone else to yell after. And his favorite guy at that point was Ted Kennedy. So all of a sudden the cheer went from "Come on, Peter" to "Come on, Teeter," which was Ted Kennedy's nickname, of course. And so that picture that we saw was the very first time that John Arnott had met his idol, Ted Kennedy. There's Ted Kennedy signing a stick for him, and John Arnott, who got into a little trouble later on, minor at that, but because of his status as the Leafs' top fan, he was put on Hockey Night in Canada in the 1950s. And I mentioned that he owned a gas station. It was a Shell station. You have to remember that Hockey Night in Canada was sponsored by Esso at the time. So there's Ward Cornell talking to John Arnott about Pete Langell, about Teeter Kennedy. And by the way, what do you do for a living, John? And John said, "Oh, I own a Shell gas station at Dufferin." And whoa, hang on for a second. You can imagine that the sponsors were not very happy with Ward Cornell or this guest at that particular time as well. So Ted Kennedy, as we were talking, gets Charlie Conacher's number 9, and he has a terrific year that season. Scores 28 goals, 32 assists, leads the Leafs in scoring that season as well. He's certainly become the leader of the team, right there with Sillaps, and certainly went on to be one of the greats of all time. That's Ted Teeter Kennedy. So Conn Smythe's motto was, and if any of you have seen the book in either your library or somebody else's, but it was, "If you can't beat him in the alley, beat him on the ice." And that was his motto for the 46-47 team. He wanted a team that was skilled, but he wanted a tough team too. And the defense that I mentioned a little bit earlier, Garth Bush, Gus Mortson, Jimmy Thompson, they could certainly all play into that motto too. Ed Fitkin was writing books at the time. He was also the public relations director for the Toronto Maple Leafs. And he had a great quote concerning the motto that Conn Smythe had. "This was a team with fighting spirit above and beyond the call of duty. Swashbuckling, cocky, they roamed the ice lanes like bold buccaneers, incessantly on the spoor of victory, rough and rugged." Well, a whole lot of purple prose there for sure. But that was it. They were a tough team to play. They were cocky. They were young. They were talented. And they really started to grow together as a team as well. The first line was Apps, Ezenicki, and Watson, a formidable line. Imagine the second line, Ted Kennedy, Vic Lynn, and Howie Meeker. That's a pretty formidable line too. The penalty killers were terrific. Joe Kluke and Nick Metz, who we've talked about as well. On defense, Jimmy Thompson and Gus Mortson played together. Bob Goldham with Garth Bush. And the fifth defenseman, if you can believe this, was already one of the stars of the team, was Wally Stanowski, well known to a lot of us who belong to the Society for International Hockey Research. So imagine that quintet, I guess I should say. I almost said quartet. That quintet of defensemen playing for your team. Sounds pretty good. Turk Broda in goal. Wow, what a lineup. Some of the things that happened that season. January 8th, 1947, Howie Meeker, the rookie on the team, scores 5 goals against the Chicago Blackhawks. The problem is, Wally Stanowski swears up and down that he got 2 of them. And the newspaper of the time, not even later on, would agree. Look at that. The scoring amendment, which gave rookie Howie Meeker 5 goals in last week's game against Chicago here. I know both the disputed goals were carom shots, and it was hard to see who actually did the scoring at the time. Later, when I checked with all the parties concerned, I gave the proper credit to Meeker. Graham explained he was the scorer, the head scorer at that time. Well, that wasn't necessarily the fact. The fact actually was that Conn Smythe really wanted Howie Meeker to be the rookie of the year. And so scoring a hat trick was one thing. Scoring 5 goals in a game was unprecedented. And so Conn Smythe convinced the referee to give the 2 that Stanowski scored, even though it may be dubious in exactly who scored, to Howie Meeker. So Howie Meeker went down in history as the guy to score 5 goals in a game. And and shortly thereafter, he went on to be the rookie of the year. What did, we talked to Wally Stanowski a couple times. I think I had maybe one of the last interviews he ever had before we lost him. And he told me Connie Smythe was just trying to promote Meeker for the Rookie of the Year award, so talked the referees into giving him the goals. But he never forgave Howie Meeker. And Meeker candidly never forgave Stanowski. Meeker just kind of blew it off. Hey, if he wants to go back and have the goals, take them. Well, it wasn't quite that easy 40 years later, 50 years later. During the season, the team faced a lot of injuries, absent Kennedy, who I mentioned. But when they got injured, they needed to bring somebody up. So they brought a guy named Sid Smith up to play on the team. He'd played in Oshawa with the Oshawa Generals. Sid Smith, again, was a terrific goal scorer, went on to be a captain with the team as well. And sometimes I know we have Blaine Smith, who joins us here on Hockey Time Machine. But the one that really is remarkable and closer to my heart is the fact that they were having some problems on defense. Garth Bush and Bob Golden were injured, so they needed to find a defenseman to fill the spot. They considered putting Bud Poyle back on defense. He played defense a few times. He wasn't a defenseman. He was actually quite a good forward. They could have gone down to the American Hockey League and gone with Pete Backor or Ernie Dickens. They both had NHL experience. Mo Morris had NHL experience as well. If they went down to Tulsa, they could have had Nick Knott, who had played with the Brooklyn Americans in 1941-42. But no, they decided that they would check out what was going on in Hollywood at the time. Not the movie schedules, the roster of the Hollywood Wolves. They had a couple of really good ins there. One was the coach, Bob Gracie, who had played with the Toronto Maple Leafs in their Stanley Cup championship in 1932. But they also had a guy named Tommy Anderson there. Tommy Anderson is a unique story. He was the Hart Trophy winner in 1941-42 with the Brooklyn Americans and never played in the NHL again. Now, he did go and serve his country at that point, but he didn't have a spot. He became the property of the Toronto Maple Leafs, and he didn't have a spot on the roster. So he was sent down to work with the Hollywood Wolves and mentor some of the young talent that was there. One of the players that he mentored was this kid named Bill Barilko. I could talk about Barilko forever. There's Bill Barilko, 19 years old, had just come up from the Hollywood Wolves. So Bill Barilko, who is on the 4th rung of the National Hockey League Maple Leafs system, is brought up. First of all, they thought he might play with Pittsburgh, so he was flown into Pittsburgh. Then they said, no, the Leafs need you. So he took a train to Buffalo because there was a huge storm going on. Then he jumped in a taxi in Buffalo, not really knowing the lay of the land, and said, can you get me to Toronto? Well, you can imagine that the taxi driver was salivating with the money that he was going to get. Sure, I'll take you to Toronto. So Barilko's in a taxi and they drive to Toronto. And they go right to Varsity Arena on Bloor Street here in Toronto. It's where the Leafs were practicing at the time. And Barilko goes out there and, I mentioned that they were a pretty cocksure team. Well, he was pretty cocky too. Hey, here I am, he announces to everybody. And so he's out there practicing and he's body checking his own players. Now, they were playing against each other in practice, but they belonged to the Toronto Maple Leafs. So finally, Hap Day who's coaching the team, had to go over there and say, hey, kid, they're on your team. You don't hurt your teammates, for God's sake. So Bill came up with a plan. If he was going to body check one of his teammates, he was going to do a roadrunner beep, beep, meep, meep. And that would give them a signal that they were about to get a shoulder into their solar plexus or their shoulders or their chest or whatever. So he came in and he was cocky and confident, and they figured he would probably play for 4 or 5 games. Well, they go to Montreal for the first game. They're on the road, and Barilko's put into the lineup. And he's body checking Elmer Locke, Maurice Richard, Butch Bouchard, some of the greats of the game. So the game ends up, and I can't remember the score. I think it was 10-2, something like that. The Leafs lost in a landslide. But the press, the Toronto press and the Montreal press, were really impressed by Bill Barilko because he stood out head and shoulders over all of his teammates in that game. They come to Toronto for the next game. They're playing the New York Rangers. Same thing. Barilko really stands out as one of the stars of the game. So what ends up happening, and I'll cut to the chase, is rather than 4 or 5 games, he ends up staying with the team for 5 years. We'll talk more about that in just a moment's time. So the team finishes second that year, 1946-47. They finish second. They eliminate the Detroit Red Wings. They go on and meet the Montreal Canadiens in the final. Game 2, Maurice Richard is cut by Vic Lynn. Sorry, it goes the other way around. Pardon me. Lynn is cut by Maurice Richard. He ends up getting a 5-minute penalty. A little bit later on, Bill Azanicki gets cut over the head by Richard and ends up picking up stitches. So Richard earns a match penalty and a 1-game suspension and a $250 fine. You can imagine the Montreal Canadiens at this point losing their best player. Remember, or not, in 1944-45, Maurice Richard scored 50 goals in 50 games. So to lose him in the Stanley Cup final because of his nonsense, I'll say, but his aggressive play was really a serious loss to them. The match penalty meant that Montreal played shorthanded for 20 minutes. It's the way it was at the time. The Leafs won the game 4-0. They ended up winning the series 4-2. The Leafs have won the Stanley Cup. It didn't take 3 to 5 years. It took a matter of 1 year. Now, the Stanley Cup wasn't even on hand at the time. The Stanley Cup was in Montreal. Conn Smythe didn't want to have the superstition of Conn Smythe didn't want to have the Stanley Cup on hand. So it was brought into the team the next day. Boy, oh boy, I'm yapping a whole lot. There's the Stanley Cup. You can see it certainly has been refigured since. There's Sil Apps, the captain of the team, Hap Day, the coach of the team. At the time, the Stanley Cup at the top was removable, and they called it the Stovepipe Stanley Cup because of the size and the shape. It was changed a couple of years later. Pardon me. Well, 1947-48 now. They're the Stanley Cup champions. Conn Smythe feels that they've had a successful season, but he wants more strength. He always felt that strength down the middle was important. He's got Turk Broda in net. He wants 3 great centers. He's already got Apps. He's already got Kennedy. So he pulls the trigger on a trade on November 2nd, 1947, and picks up Max Bentley, one of the great stars of the Chicago Blackhawks, along with a guy named Cy Thomas. There's Bentley coming on the train from Chicago, Cy Thomas in behind them, ready to join their Toronto Maple Leafs teammates. And the trade goes for Gay Stewart, Bud Poyle, and Gus Bodner, who were called the Flying Forts. They all came from Fort William. All were projects of Squib Walker, as well as Bob Goldham and Ernie Dickens. So it's a 5-for-2 trade, but it ends up being an incredible trade for the Toronto Maple Leafs. Chicago had finished last that season, but still, Max Bentley was playing with his brother Doug on the Chicago Blackhawks. So I thought we'd show a video that Paul has come up with, a great video that gives us some background on Max Bentley. There's Doug Bentley. There's Max there. They were farmers from out west. They called Max the Dipsy Doodle Dandy from DeLille, Saskatchewan. There they are on their wheat farm. Getting ready for the season. Everybody else is working on their push-ups, their sit-ups. These boys are working on their farming. Great brothers, great players. Both were all-stars. Hard to split them up, but Max was asked whether he would take a trade to Toronto. He agreed that he would, and so Conn Smythe got his strength down the middle. That season, let's look at the centers. App scores 26 goals and 53 points. Kennedy gets 25 goals and 46 points. Bentley gets 23 goals and 48 points. You have to put it in perspective. It's not like today where they're getting 100, 120 points. Those were formidable amounts. Turk Broda won the Vezina Trophy that year. The Maple Leafs finished first. They play against Boston in the semifinal. Take them 4-1. They go against Detroit in the Stanley Cup final. They win 4-0. The Stanley Cup was actually won in Detroit. There they are. There's Nick Metz on the left, Hap Day, the coach, in the middle, Wally Stanowski on the right-hand side. You can see that the Stanley Cup has changed shape. And there they are, holding hands in the most wonderful way. The Stanley Cup, again, was not on hand when the Toronto Maple Leafs won it in Detroit. Again, it stayed in Montreal. The Stanley Cup was brought in the next day. The Leafs take the train back to Toronto, and they're greeted at Union Station by thousands. And when I say thousands, tens and tens of thousands of people to welcome them back. The Stanley Cup champions for the second year in a row. They were driven in convertibles up Bay Street to a civic reception at what we know today as Old City Hall. And while they were at that reception, Syl Apps made a momentous decision. Well, he made the decision before, but he made a wild announcement that he was going to retire from hockey. He was 33 years old. He was going to move into politics. And at that time, Ted Kennedy was announced as the new captain of the Toronto Maple Leafs. So there we go, 2 Stanley Cups in a row. Could they make it a third? Well, just wait and see. So here we go. It's now time for 1948-49. They trade Wally Stanowski to the New York Rangers in a package that brings them Cal Gardner and Bill Jusda, tough defenseman from Winnipeg. Wally Stanowski had asked for the trade. He wanted to get a better opportunity. He'd gotten in trouble for sneaking his wife into the hotel room during training camp that year. You'd think that would be okay, married guys, but anyway, he gets traded. They bring up some more of the young talent. Les Costello comes up from the St. Michael's Majors. Todd Sloan also comes up from St. Mike's. From the Marlboroughs, they get Ray Timgren. Danny Lewicki was considered the top junior prospect in all of Canada. They finally got him after much negotiation. And the team flounders a little bit, but they still made the playoffs. They finished in 4th place. The leading scorer that year, Harry Watson, who they'd picked up, as I mentioned, the year before, he scores 26 goals and 45 points. They play against the Boston Bruins in the first round of the playoffs. And they win 4-0. Second round, they're playing the Red Wings once again in the Stanley Cup final. They sweep the Red Wings once again. They go all the way through the Stanley Cup playoffs, winning 8 games in a row. They win the Stanley Cup for a third time. And this time the Stanley Cup was on hand. It gets pushed on a table to center ice. And here we can see some of the captains of the team through the years. There's, there we've got, why can I not remember his name? He was the captain of the team. Oh my goodness. I'll come back to him. I can't believe I can't remember his name. I should certainly remember. He played with my uncle. Anyway, there's Syl Apps, who's the captain in this picture. Ted Kennedy's the assistant. Hap Day had been a captain of the team even earlier than that. And so there we go. We've got 4 captains of the Toronto Maple Leafs, all working with the team at that time. God, why can I not remember his name? I mentioned him earlier. He was coaching the Marlboros, went on to be the head scout, and we go from there. But anyway, it'll come back to me. And Hap Day, of course, is the coach of that time. We've got Sillaps retiring and Ted Kennedy picking up the mantle from there. Excuse me, everybody. There we go. So they're the very first NHL team to win 3 Stanley Cup championships in a row, and they start the dynasty. Here's Hap Day waving his hat on the bench. Just to his left, Howie Meeker. Just to his right, we've got Bill Jusda right there. We've got some journalists and some photographers as they celebrate the Stanley Cup championship. During the summer of 1949, Bill Barilko goes into business, not hockey business, into the appliance business. He and his brother Alex, open up Barilko Brothers. It's a place on the Danforth, for those who know the Toronto area, just beside, well, very close to the Danforth Music Hall. And they open it up and they sell appliances, they sell fishing gear, they sell records, 78 records. So those of us who are a little bit older would know 78 RPM records. So here they are at the opening of the store. We can see Sid Smith leaning down here, Harry Watson's standing, Bill Barilko there, Turk Broda in the middle, Jimmy Thompson to his right, Ray Timgren to the end of the right, and Fleming McKell leaning down, facing Sid Smith at the other end of the table. And here they are at the opening of Barilko Brothers. Well, it was an odd thing for them to do. They were talked into it. Bill's mother and his sister said, "You guys don't know anything about business," but they thought they'd give it a shot. It was a very popular place. The guys would show up from time to time, but because they didn't have the finger on the pulse, ultimately the gentlemen who were running it took advantage of the accounting, I guess I should say, and ultimately the place was sold off. But we'll get to that in a few moments' time. Excuse me. Am I talking too much? Absolutely. There's proof positive. So we go into the 1949-50 season, and the team goes into a skid off the front of the schedule. So Conn Smythe needs to do something. There are 2 things going on at the time. The Grey Cup is going on. The football championship is going on around that time. Plus, they're on a winless skid right now. So what does he do? He pulls what he calls I guess he didn't call it, but the media called it the Battle of the Bulge. Smythe announces that some of his team members are too big. Garth Bush, Vic Lynn, Howie Meeker, Sid Smith, Harry Watson, and as you can see here, Turk Broda are ordered to lose weight. They had to lose some weight. So here's Turk Broda right here working out, trying to lose 9 pounds so he can get back into the lineup. Oh my God, I'm tired watching. Come on, just 5 more, 4 more. There we go. Ooh, sweating up a storm. Ooh, I can feel those pounds melting off. Look at that svelte body. Holy moly. Yep, I'm feeling good. I can think about the food that's on the table shortly thereafter. 3 sticks of celery and whatever else they've got at that time. There's his wife, Betty, preparing a nice meal for him. Oh, it was a piece of celery. There you go, Turk. Well, it was a bit of a ruse, to be very candid, but in the process, it made huge media attention, which brought them under the Toronto Maple Leaf, not the Toronto Maple Leaf, the Toronto Daily newspaper pages while the Grey Cup was going on. It showed that Conn Smythe was the guy in charge at that particular time. And finally, they decided they would get somebody else. They brought Gil Mayer up. Now, whereas Turk Broda was on the huskier side, Gil Mayer, his nickname was the Needle. So you can imagine what his physique was like. Just a little guy, short and slim, I guess I should say. The Leafs went winless in 7 games in a row. Finally, Turk Broda, 9 pounds lighter, returns and shuts out the Rangers. Now, if he was to tell you the truth off of the record, he would tell you that he didn't lose an ounce, or if he did, maybe it was just a little bit. He certainly didn't lose 9 pounds, but at any rate, there we go. Broda started to falter in late December once again, so the Leafs decided to bring in a replacement, and they brought in Al Rollins. His son's birthday today by not fluke, but we'll go from there. Al Rollins is the gentleman on the left, Turk Broda on the right. And they kind of platooned that season. Al Rollins had been playing with the Cleveland Barons of the American Hockey League at that time. So the Leafs go on and they finish third that year, and they face the Detroit Red Wings in the semifinal. And in game 1, there's an incident that changes the perspective of the series at that particular time. Ed Fitkin, who was the public relations man that I mentioned earlier, wrote, "It happened late in the game with Toronto ahead 4-0. Ted Kennedy was carrying the puck, and Howe cut across to check Ted. Catching a glimpse of Howe, Kennedy pulled up sharply and passed the puck ahead to Sid Smith. Meanwhile, Howe crashed into the boards face first, and Gordy lay on the ice, unconscious, with blood streaming from his nose and his eye. He seemed to be gravely injured. The Red Wings were badly shaken, and they were really, really upset. You can see here that everybody was upset. Leafs, Red Wings. He's being carried off on a stretcher, and it did not look good. They thought it was going to be a brain injury. They brought his family in from Saskatchewan. A couple days later, whether his mother slipped or not, I don't know, but they asked how her son was doing, expecting to hear a horrendous story, and she said, yeah, he's got a bad headache, but he's doing okay. So was it embellished a little bit? Who knows? Who knows what happens in hockey sometimes, especially back during that era. Stan Fischler was writing in Sports Illustrated, and he wrote, Howe tumbled face first into the thick wooden sideboards. Seconds later, he was lying unconscious on the ice, his face covered with blood. As 13,659 fans sat horror-struck, Gordie Howe, the young favorite, was carried off the ice on a stretcher and removed to Harper Hospital, which was in Detroit. For several hours, there was a question whether he would survive at all. A call was put through to Saskatoon, urging Gordie's mother to take the first plane to Detroit so she could be at her son's bedside. As it turned out, Gordie didn't die. 2 days later, when Mrs. Howe got in from Saskatchewan, she told reporters, he still has a headache, but he's feeling fine. Kind of blew the story, didn't I? Sorry about that. Anyway, we'll find out how it went. Detroit's theory was completely the opposite. They felt that Peter Kennedy had speared Gordie Howe deliberately. Kennedy offered to take an oath, saying, I didn't cause the injury. He said, I saw Howe lying on the ice with his face covered with blood, and I couldn't help thinking what a great player he was and how I hoped he wasn't badly hurt. Then Detroit players started saying I did it with my stick. I knew I hadn't, and as I've always regarded Coach Tommy Ivan, Detroit's coach, as a sensible, level-headed man, I went over to the Detroit bench and told him I was sorry Howe was hurt, but that I wasn't responsible. Well, they said he did it on purpose, that he was trying to take Howe out of the series. NHL President Clarence Campbell and referee Georges Gravel finally exonerated Kennedy, and Howe would later join them in saying, no, Kennedy didn't touch me. But the damage had been done, and the Red Wings sought revenge. The very next play, after Howe was taken off the ice, Sid Abel slashed Ted Kennedy across the ankle, with a two-handed slash, trying to take him out of the series. Clearly, the Red Wings were out to punish Kennedy during this whole series. So, as Fitkin said again, Ted was a marked man on a night of bitterness. He came out of the game with a discolored eye and a cut lip, but not once had he backed down, nor did he complain. Well, the end of the story, the Red Wings went on to eliminate the Maple Leafs in Game 7 in overtime, 8:39 of overtime. Leo Reese, who was a defenseman, not a great scorer, took a shot. It hit Bill Barilko, caromed into the net behind Turk Broda, and the Red Wings won the series. Later, they would go on to win the Stanley Cup. So that's the end of 1949-50. So the Leafs were not able to take 4 Stanley Cup championships in a row. But the dynasty wasn't over, nor was my raspy throat. I wish the cat could fetch me water, but he always hogs the dish. I don't know. Anyways, 1950, 1951 now, and some changes happen in the head office of the Maple Leafs. Hap Day gets promoted to assistant GM from being the coach. And they bring in Joe Primo to coach the team. There's Primo on the left, Hap Day standing on the right, and Conn Smythe in the middle. So he's got a terrific management team at this point. Joe Primo had won the Stanley Cup with the Leafs in 1932. Hap Day was on that same team. They both had coached teams. Joe Primo had coached St. Mike's. He had coached in the seniors as well, in the Allen Cup as well. Hap Day had certainly been successful as a coach. So Conn Smythe is smiling like the butcher's dog, as we say. At this point, as I mentioned before, Al Rowlands continues to platoon with Turk Broda. They realize that Broda is a veteran, probably nearing the end of his career. They've got young Al Rowlands who helped them in the 1949-50 season. So they feel like they're in good stead with Al Rowlands in goal as well. Garth Bush decides to retire. He's going to go back to farming in Western Canada. So he was one of the key people on the blue line at that time. But they don't need to worry because they've got Thompson, they've got Mortson, they've got Barilko, they've got Bill Jusda as well. And fairly soon they'll pick another person as well, and that's Fern Flaman from the Boston Bruins. So they've got a terrific blue line again. Lots of things going on. They send Bill Ezenicki and Vic Lynn to Boston for Flaman, as I mentioned. Also Phil Maloney, Kenny Smith, and Leo Boyven, who started his NHL career with the Toronto Maple Leafs. We forget about that because we quite often think of him as one of the stalwarts with the Boston Bruins, and later on a captain as well. An odd incident took place in January 1951. It was the marriage of John McCormick. That wasn't odd, but the ramifications were. John McCormick was one of the forwards. He was more of a defensive forward at that time. Tall and slim, really good guy, really good hockey player, had been brought in from Western Canada as well. And John McCormick's girlfriend was pregnant at that point. So he decided that he was going to get married, which was wonderful. They have a lovely ceremony on the ice. The Leaf teammates stand up on either side of him, stand up, hold their sticks up and cross them. And McCormick and his wife go underneath the sticks and they go to center ice. They get a few gifts. And one of the gifts was from Conn Smythe. It was an envelope, a wonderful envelope for a honeymoon. He was sent down to the Pittsburgh Hornets. Why? Because he got married during the hockey season. He didn't like that at all. Conn Smythe didn't like it at all. You can imagine McCormick didn't like it at all either. All of a sudden, he has to tell his new bride, honey, we're moving to Pittsburgh. Pack up the apartment. And there we go. Never played another game for the Toronto Maple Leafs. So the Leafs finish in second place that season. Todd Sloan is the leading goal scorer that year, gets 31 goals to lead the team. He was one of the ones who came up from the Toronto St. Michael's majors. In the semifinal, they faced the Boston Bruins once again. We don't hear a few of the team names. We don't hear Chicago. We don't hear New York. They were the also-rans in the National Hockey League at the time. The second game of the semifinal is an odd one. It ended in a tie. It's a playoff game. A tie? You play till you win. Well, no. During that era, in Toronto anyway, games had to end by 11:45 in the evening, and because that was when games had to finish. It was Toronto the Good. You can't have games going on later. So when the game was tied at 1-1 at 11:45, it was declared a tie. Anyway, the Maple Leafs went on to win the series in 6 games. And who did they face in the Stanley Cup final? Their arch rivals, the Montreal Canadiens, the only 2 Canadian teams in the National Hockey League, and they'd only met in the Stanley Cup final once before. So this is going to be a wild and woolly Stanley Cup final. Every single game went into overtime that year. Unprecedented. The first game, Toronto wins 3-2. Sid Smith scores the winning goal. Game 2, Montreal wins 3-2. Maurice Richard scores the winning goal in overtime. Game 3, Toronto wins 2-1. Ted Kennedy scores in overtime. Game 4, Toronto wins 3-2. Harry Watson scores in overtime. So all of a sudden, it's the Toronto Maple Leafs up 3-1 going into Game 5. Well, they're playing at Maple Leaf Gardens, and going into the third period, the Montreal Canadiens are up 2-1. They don't know what to do. Well, I guess they do know what to do. Late in the period, Joe Primo pulls Al Rollins. They play with 6 attackers, and with 32 seconds left to play, Todd Sloan scores to tie the game, and yet again, the game goes into overtime. Everybody's watching the clock. It's past 11 o'clock, and if they went to 11:45, the game would be decided as a tie. Never got that far. What I think we'll do at this point is show you how the game ended. We can watch the Burlko clip.
Watson comes back fast at center ice, steaming down the left wing, into the corner, shoots and hits the side of the net. Here's right in front of Meeker. Meeker went by the net, centers out in front. McNeil fell right in front again. Watson shoots. Meeker to score! Burlko! Burlko has won the Stanley Cup for the Leafs. Burlko scooped it into the net while McNeil was left all by himself. The Toronto Maple Leafs are the world champions.
I am so sorry I talked all over that. The illustrious Foster Hewitt will never forgive me, nor will you viewers. Certainly Glenn and Paul won't, but I'll take the spanking afterwards. Well, that sounded a little weird, but anyway.
Hey, let me just tell you something good.
Yeah.
You didn't talk over Foster Hewitt. Foster Hewitt talked over you.
Well,
while he's talking, the platform we're on automatically mutes you.
Oh, okay. Okay, gotcha.
So we apologize for not hearing what you had to say.
Well, I'm so glad you said that, and I appreciate that. What has happened here is that Paul and Glenn have done some magic. Paul, in the most miraculous discovery since King Tut's tomb, was able to find this footage of Burlko's goal. Nobody knew that it existed. It had shown up, or parts of it had shown up in different newsreels and things like that, but nobody had seen the entire game. And Paul was able to find it up in the archives in Ottawa. And he was able to marry that with the radio play-by-play that Foster Hewitt did to give us something really, really special. So thank you, Glenn. Thank you, Paul. And thanks for giving me a little bit of a reprieve.
Well, tell you what, I'm going to go away now. I'm going to play this clip again so you can watch it, and then you can talk on the other side of it.
I like that. Thanks a million, Glenn. That's a great idea.
Watson comes back fast at center ice, steaming down the left wing, into the corner, shoots and hits the side of the net. Here's right in front of Meeker. Meeker went by the net, centers out in front. McNeil fell right in front again. Watson shoots. Meeker to score! Burlko! Burlko has won the Stanley Cup for the Leafs. Burlko scooped it into the net while McNeil was left all by himself. The Toronto Maple Leafs are the world champions.
So there we are, the 4th Stanley Cup championship in 5 games, in 5 years. We're going to come back to the celebration in just a moment's time, but going to talk a little bit more about the actual photo, the actual goal. First of all, the goaltender for the Montreal Canadiens was Jerry McNeil. Now, he was focused. He was a very good goaltender. In fact, his daughter had been born that day. Here he was in Toronto having to think about the Stanley Cup final when back home, Mom had a brand new baby girl. It marred his career in many ways. He suffered from nerves, things of that sort. There's a great newspaper clip of the goal from 2 different angles. The one on the bottom is taken by the famous Turovsky brothers. And they were the ones who get most of the accolades because they were the best marketers. They hustled around and got everybody to use their photos. The one on the top was taken by a guy named Michael Burns, and Michael Burns has a great shot. It's hard to see there, but Barilko, he's on the other side of the ice from the Turovsky brothers. But in Burns' shot, which is a fraction of a second after the Turovsky goal, you can see that Barilko has seen the puck enter the net. And he has a slight smile on his face. He has seen that he has scored the winning goal. Remarkable shots, and remarkable to line them up that way. Thank you, Paul, for this. Really, really special. There's actually a third shot as well. Another shot was taken. And again, back when they were using speed graphic cameras, they had to use a slide that was put in and the whole bit to get 3 shots within fractions of a second of each other is remarkable. The fact that anybody did is remarkable. Why weren't some of the photographers in the Montreal Canadiens, or at least in the Leafs end, hoping the Montreal Canadiens will score? I guess they knew better. Anyway, I'm going to be chastised for that one. I can feel it now. Anyway, it was a terrific, terrific time. Bill Barilko was not a prolific goal scorer by any means. He could score the odd goal, but in fact, he was more of a defensive defenseman. And in this particular game, and through most of the season, he was paired with Fern Flaman. So what had happened was he was taking a few risks during the game. And Coach Joe Primo had sat him down in the intermission between the third period and the intermission and said, look at Bill, you can't be gambling like you're doing. As you can see, or maybe you can't remember, it's tough to say, but if Barilko had missed that shot, Maurice Richard was right behind him, and he's got a clear break all the way down to Al Rollins. So Barilko says, don't worry, coach, I won't gamble anymore. And Smythe adds, and if you do, you'll be fined $50, which was a considerable amount of money at the time. So here's Bill Barilko, 24 years old, young kid. He sees the puck at the face-off circle. He's on the blue line. Does he gamble and go after it and try and take a shot on net, or even get it deep? Or does he pull back and retreat and let Richard take the puck and go from there? He decides to gamble, contrary to what his bosses say. He backhands the puck over McNeil's shoulder. There he is, Cal Gardner. I think maybe it's Watson. Excuse me. It's Harry Watson. There's Butch Bouchard, the defenseman, on the other side. But they can't stop Bill Barilko, and he scores the Stanley Cup winning goal. We've got a video clip of some of the celebration after the goal. It's kind of fun to watch. Al Rollins, number 23 for the Leafs, played goal. Here they are on the ice. They're not crowding around the Stanley Cup at this point. They're cheering for their champion. Oh, here he's being lifted by Cal Gardner and Bill Jusda. There's his coach, Joe Primo, with Conn Smythe, Bill Barilko in the middle, Ted Kennedy, the captain of the team. They're getting ready to get the Stanley Cup. Ted Kennedy all anxious. There we go. There's the beautiful Stanley Cup, the remodeled Stanley Cup from Clarence Campbell, the NHL president, at center ice of Maple Leaf Gardens. Shaking hands, obviously. And there they are the next day. The next day, the Leafs got together with the Stanley Cup for one final picture. What's significant in this shot is that it's the very final time Bill Barilko would put on a Maple Leaf sweater. Sad, sad story. That summer, most of us know the story. If not, we certainly know the Tragically Hip song. But that summer, he went on a fishing trip, late April, just before training camp. Went with his dentist. And they went fishing for Arctic char in a remote area, northern Quebec. And the plane never returned. In fact, they didn't find the plane. There it is. There's the wreckage that was found again in 1962. That's the first time the wreckage was found, from 1951 to 1962. Why? Well, because the forest north of Cochrane, first of all, they didn't know where it was. They were trying to follow a flight plan, but they couldn't find the plane. And the forests around Cochrane, Ontario, are unforgiving. The trees are dense. There's a lot of swampland, and there's the fuselage of the plane. They found the boys in 1962. Their skeletal remains. I don't mean to be macabre, but the skeletal remains still strapped into the cockpit of the plane. Finally, the mystery had been solved, and as Gord Downie and the Tragically Hip sang, in a song called 50 Mission Cap, he outlines the entire story of Bill Barilko. And they wouldn't win another until 1962, the year he was discovered. So there we go. Joe Primo, as I mentioned, he had experience as a coach, not as an NHL coach, but he had won a Memorial Cup championship with the St. Michael's Majors. He'd won an Allen Cup championship, and now he was a Stanley Cup champion as well. So 4 Stanley Cup championships in 5 years. I mentioned about the loss of Bill Barilko, but there was more that went on that year that changed the trajectory of the Toronto Maple Leafs. One of the things was that Squib Walker passed away on May 27th, 1951. So just after the Stanley Cup championship celebration. Squib Walker had been an important part of the team, as I had talked earlier, and a close friend of Conn Smythe, and that was a real loss. He'd been a scout with the team since 1927 when Conn Smythe bought the team, so he'd been the head scout for some time. He was primarily a bond and insurance broker. A funny story during a sad time was when he would sign the players to signing bonuses, he would offer $100 more than he really wanted, asking for that money to go to him to put into an insurance bond or something of that sort. So he would get the commission on it. Guess you guys got to do what a guy's got to do. Then later on that summer, Bill Barilko, as I mentioned, the fishing trip, he was lost as of August 26th, 1951. We saw the crash site just north of Cochrane, Ontario. During that same time, we lost J.P. Bickle. We didn't. The Toronto Maple Leafs did. He died on August 22nd, 1951. There he is there. He'd been such an important part of the team. He had helped Conn Smythe in so many ways. He kept the team in Toronto when it was threatening to move to Philadelphia, as I said. He was a mining magnate. He was heavily involved with famous players' theaters in financing them. He started McIntyre Mine up in the Timmins area as well. And the McIntyre Arena was actually built with his money, but fashioned after Maple Leaf Gardens. He had all kinds of things he was involved in. Sick Kids Hospital. He donated much of his money and his will to Sick Kids Hospital. So he was really an important man in Canada, really important man in Toronto, but in the lives of Toronto Maple Leaf fans, and specifically Conn Smythe, he was ultra important. So losing Squib Walker, J.P. Bickle, and then Bill Barilko in short order was devastating to the team. Around the same time, Turk Broder retired. He was replaced permanently by Al Rollins. And then they decided that Al Rollins wasn't the guy. In 1952, they traded for Harry Lumley. But it was a tough decade from there. After winning the Stanley Cup championship in 1951-52, they finished third, but again, they didn't go far. In 52-53, they missed the playoffs entirely. Joe Primo decides that he's done with coaching. He wants to get to his business, which was building blocks and cement blocks. And so he retired. King Clancy is brought in as coach. King Clancy had been in that same 1932 Stanley Cup team, but he had also been a referee, and he had coached later on the Pittsburgh Hornets. So he knew how to coach. He came in to coach the team. And then they finished third that year, but they didn't win the Stanley Cup. Excuse me. I apologize, everyone. 54-55, they finished third again, didn't win the cup. 55-56, they finished fourth. 56-57, they finished fifth. That time, the management changes one more time. Hap Day resigns from the team. He'd been with them since they were the Toronto St. Pats. He had been a player, he'd been captain, he'd been a coach, he'd been assistant general manager, but he felt that Conn Smythe had undermined him in a media conference, and so he resigned. And what did he do? Well, he resigned from the Maple Leafs, but he also resigned from C. Smythe for Sand, which was Conn Smythe's aggregate business. He left to go back to St. Thomas, and he started a wood handle business, handles for axes and things of that sort. Quite lucrative for him as well. Got out of the hockey circuit altogether from there. 57-58, they finish in last place. 58-59, they finish in fourth, but still are a woeful team. Finally, something happens. In 1959-60, what happens is that the youth movement of the Toronto Marlboros and the Toronto St. Michael's Majors rejuvenates the team. They bring in George Armstrong. He'd been part of the team during the 50s, but he really became a force that year. Dick Duff and Armstrong came from, well, he played with Stratford, but he later came from the Toronto Toronto Marlboros, rather. Dick Duff comes from St. Mike's. Billy Harris comes from the Marlboros, dependable third-line center. Tim Horton, who'd been with the team for the better part of that decade, but really trying to find his place more than anything. He, in effect, replaced Bill Barilko on the blue line, but he came from St. Michael's as well. Bobby Bond from the Marlboros, Carl Brewer from the Marlboros, Bob Pulford from the Marlboros, Bob Nevin from the Marlboros. You can see that the farm team paid huge dividends once again, once it had been replenished. So Brewer, Bond, Harris, Pulford, Nevin, they had all been part of the Toronto Marlboros, who won the Memorial Cup in back-to-back seasons, 1955 and 1956. So they knew about championships, they knew about winning, and when they joined the Toronto Maple Leafs, they certainly helped that way too. Harold Ballard and Stafford Smythe had been running the Toronto Marlboros when they won those championships. But in 57, they were brought in to be part of a management team. It wasn't Ballard at first, but certainly Stafford Smythe was going to take over from Conn Smythe when he was done. And they put together a consortium of executives to do exactly that. We'll save that for another program, but Stafford and Ballard had a great deal of pedigree from being with the Maple Leafs organization. What I want to show now is a video that Paul has provided for us, has found for us. And one of the main reasons that the Leafs were so successful, we've talked about a lot of players, but I gave kind of short shift to Ted Kennedy on purpose, because I really wanted you to get the impact of what Ted Kennedy meant to this team at that time. So let's watch the clip about Ted Kennedy.
Can we just look like we're watching the clip about Ted Kennedy?
We can
Because
indeed.
you don't actually have it, but it would be okay with me if we want to look like we're watching it. Ooh.
Why don't
I could put it in later.
Would do.
But
do we
look
have
at that play.
Do we have the other video of the Leafs dynasty?
We're out of clips.
Okay, great. That's fine.
So I can add them in editing and in post-production.
No need. But what I'm trying to impact on everybody is that this was a dynamic team. They were a dynasty in the truest sense of the word. 4 Stanley Cup championships in 5 seasons, with a core group of finely honed talent that was brought up from various sources, but primarily from the farm team system that Stafford Smythe had put together. And they really were, in my opinion, the first dynasty in the National Hockey League, the first true dynasty in the National Hockey League. There would be some later on, including the Leafs again in the 1960s, as I was alluding to with some of the players that came up to the team. But that 1947 to 1951 period was very, very special. It started slowly, and then all of a sudden it skyrocketed. there was that hiccup in 1950. In fact, if you ask any of the players if they were still with us about the team, they would swear up and down that they should have won in 1950, and in fact should have won a few more in the early part of the 1950s had Barilko been there, had injuries not prevailed, and things of that sort. So the fact was, it skyrocketed. It was a wonderful time for Toronto. It was a wonderful time for Leafs Nation. Certainly a wonderful time for the Toronto Maple Leafs as well. And they enjoyed it immensely. Went on from there to a tough time during the 1950s. The Montreal Canadiens had an even better dynasty. 5 Stanley Cup championships in 5 years, culminating in 1960. And then we go into the 1960s and beyond. So a glorious time, part of what we call, wrongly, but the original 6 era. But it was the 6 teams that we know so well from our parents, from our youths, from our Beehive corn syrup cards, whatever it happens to be. And a wonderful time for hockey all in all. So if there are any questions or comments, if we have a few minutes, I'll be happy to take those. If not, I'll turn things back to Glenn and Paul, and we will thank you very much for your rapt attention and for trying to reach through the screen to give me a glass of water.
Well, I enjoyed it immensely. I know our audience did. This was a great trip through history, and we don't have the ability to take questions here. Kevin, should you wish to drop by the Zoom, which is going to come up next, then I'm sure the people there would want to pepper you with questions and their memories and thoughts. But as far as this broadcast goes, we can thank you immensely and say goodnight.
Before we do, I want to thank you so much, Glenn. You were shuffling like a madman there with all the photos I sent to you and the videos that Paul so wonderfully gave. I want to thank Paul for inviting me back to join today and talk about one of my favorite subjects, but also for starting Hockey Time Machine those 3 years ago. It really was a joy for the longest time for me as well. I've had to move away with some other things that I was working on at the time, but boy, oh boy, I just think it's one of the most special things that's going on right now. And through it, I've had a chance to meet Glenn and Billy Hunt and a number of other people who have made themselves known either in person or by way of social media or emails. So I want to thank you all. It's been so much fun to come back and see you, and I hope I'll get an invite again sometime soon. Thanks a million, everybody. Thanks to our sponsor as well, and we'll see you soon. I know you've got a special guest coming up, so I better not stay on too long, but I'll stay for a little while, and then your guests can come on board. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Good night, everybody.